business. The whole meeting will take 90 to 100 minutes or so. So to our speaker, Joey Clarke is an ecologist and Senior Science Communicator, Australian AWC, as I said earlier. With a lifelong passion for the natural world, he studied ecology and evolution at the Australian National University and completed an honours research project on the ecology of the black grass wren in the remote northwest Kimberley of Western Australia. Joey has worked with Australian Wildlife Conservancy for over a decade, starting as a guide at Mornington Wildlife Sanctuary, then taking on roles in fundraising and communications. Since 2020, he has hosted a series of popular online conversations about AWC's conservation work, and he has appeared regularly on national and international media as a spokesperson for the organisation. Joey has worked across AWC's network of sanctuaries from Cape York to Central Australia, the Gulf of Carpentaria, the Kimberley and outback New South Wales. So with that brief introduction, I'll hand over to welcome Joey.
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. That's the risk when you ask for a short bio, and I wrote it myself, so it's a popular online webinar series and that kind of thing. I was worried with the tech problems before I might have to start telling jokes, but anyway, luckily we've got it all up and running. There might be some of the videos and things that don't work, but that's okay, I can tell a story anyway. So just to go over a bit of my background, I guess, and introduce myself. As I said, a lifelong passion for the natural world. This is me, a cuscus. I volunteered in New Guinea for a couple of weeks many years ago now, and this was working on a tree kangaroo project in the North Coast ranges of Papua New Guinea. But I first heard about Australian Wildlife Conservancy when I was visiting Mornington Wildlife Sanctuary. Maybe some of you have been there up in the Kimberley on the Gibb River Road. And I saw this fantastic research station with ecologists living and working full time in the middle of the King Leopold Ranges, now known as the Willigan-Mulluwandi Ranges on the Fitzroy River, studying things like the purple-crowned fairy wren. And I thought, I've got to get involved. What a great organisation. That was just as I was starting my university studies. So I got up there to volunteer for a couple of weeks, which is really the best way of getting into an organisation like AWC, and spent a little while with this research project looking at purple-crowned fairy wrens. So that was my first introduction. And then I realised, actually, you don't have to volunteer. You could also study this. And even beyond that, you can do it as a job, which I just feel very lucky to be able to do that. So my honours research project was on this species, the black grass wren. Anyone in the room seen a black grass wren? Or a couple of people? Very good. Or anyone on Zoom, maybe? These are very rare birds. They're only found in the far northwest of the Kimberley. And before my project, there really wasn't any research about their ecology in the field. No one had looked at them. So the only research had been basically people going to collect them, shoot a few dozen, and then make measurements. We actually caught the first live black grass wren. So that was the first time they'd ever been caught by scientists, and fitted them with leg bands so I could follow them around and work out their home range, their habitats, and things like that. So that was my research project. And this is in an extremely remote part of the northwest Kimberley. So this is on the Charnley River. And, you know, while I was there, I kept getting distracted because it wasn't just grass wrens, but at night time, there were northern quolls raiding our camp. There were these magnificent golden-backed tree rats, these, you know, almost as big as a possum, rats galloping through the branches. All these amazing animals, which, you know, we're not familiar with in other parts of Australia. Now, I've just lost my slides there. One sec. And I realized that, you know, it's pretty special to have these animals around. And really, the sad fact is other parts of Australia aren't full of wildlife in the way that they used to be, in the way that they should be. So this was really like going back in time to that Australia that was full of animals. That's normal. That's the baseline that we should be aiming for. So that's how I got involved with AWC and my research project. And really, I guess the context for AWC is that much of the country isn't like the Kimberley anymore. We're missing a lot of that biodiversity. see if any of these videos work. I'm not sure if this one's going to. Nope. So we've got, species like the numbat, which are completely unique in the world. There's nothing else like a numbat. That represents about 40 million years of unique evolutionary history. Unique animals, we're one of the most biodiverse countries in the world, and yet we've got this really poor record of looking after this, our greatest natural asset. So you'll be familiar with the Thylacine, Tasmanian tiger. I found this great website that has newspaper articles about extinct species. And this one from 1937, saying that these things are getting quite rare. We might need to think about getting some sanctuaries set up to look after them. Does anyone know the year that the last Tasmanian tiger went extinct? 36, yeah. So a little bit too late to be calling for sanctuaries and for conservation of these species. The search being made of remote areas, sanctuaries suggested. Clearly, 80, 85 years ago, we weren't doing a good job, but surely by now something's changed, you'd think. Well, this newspaper article is from 2021, and it shows once again a unique marsupial. This is the northern betong on the brink of extinction in North Queensland. So really, if you look over time, we've continued to lose species to extinction. Things are continuing to become threatened. Oh, look, some of the animations are working. That's good. This graph shows the number of species listed as threatened under our national environmental legislation. And that's just over the last 2 decades. So not even going that far back, over 20 years. So it's gone from around 1,200 threatened species now up to almost 2,000. And that's just in the last 20 years. So that's just one way of measuring that continued decline, even in my lifetime. So what's the response? We've got declining natural capital, ecosystems starting to fall apart. And there was David Attenborough's fantastic, he called it his witness statement, A Life on Planet Earth, where he called everyone. He said, we must rewild the world. And this fantastic quote, he said, to restore stability to our planet, we must restore its biodiversity. And so Australian Wildlife Conservancy has built a model to do just that. So we do want to rewild the world. We're focusing on Australia. And so we've got this very clear mission: effective conservation of all Australian animal species and their habitats. Do we want to get rid of that box?
No, we need to share the screen. We're not seeing the presentation.
Okay. All right, just give us a sec. We'll try and... Sorry, Zoom people, we're trying our best. I think so. This is just for revision. Now I just want to get rid of that. I think it's sharing, but I just want to remove that toolbar. It's sharing. I'm floating. There we go. Okay, I think we're good. Sorry for that. So yeah, continuing capital declining. You'll have to share with your friends who are joining Zoom what this bit was about. So to restore stability to our planet, we must restore its diversity. That's what AWC is trying to do in Australia. And tonight I'd like to talk about how we do that. So our model for effective conservation, about where we're working, and then some of the really exciting new projects that we've got off the ground just over the last few years. So to start off with, if you want effective conservation of all Australian animal species, you need land to do that on. You need to be working in ecosystems that are in pretty good health. So this is now the map of projects where AWC is working around Australia. Our projects now cover almost 13 million hectares. So up until about a month ago, it was 6.5 million hectares, the same size as Tasmania. But in the last month, we've announced a new partnership with a cattle company, which I'll come to a little bit later. The way we select sanctuaries is by looking at where biodiversity is richest, looking particularly at threatened species and ecosystems that aren't already well represented in national parks or other nature reserves. So we're trying to build a portfolio that's diverse, that's got that representation of as many of Australia's animal species as possible. All of the work that we do is based on a foundation of science. So we conduct Australia's most expansive, comprehensive biodiversity survey program. That means people head out into these sanctuaries, they set live traps of different sorts. So in this picture, there's two different sorts of traps. The person in the foreground is using a funnel trap where they catch large reptiles and things that slither in and can't get out. And just behind, there's someone setting an Elliott trap, a little box trap that we use to measure populations of small mammals and diurnal reptiles. So if you think about that one trap she's holding up there, if that was left open for one night, we call that one trap night. So it's kind of a unit of measurement, a unit of this monitoring work. We do 250,000 trap nights every year. So it's this massive investment in science to understand how populations are going at all of our sanctuaries. And that, science runs through everything that we do. It's really important if we're going to understand how these ecosystems work. And the other thing that tells us is what the main threats are. So we do strategic research to understand what are the threats at play in each of these ecosystems. Part of our survey is also bird surveys. I know there's some bird watchers in the room. So this is a flock of hooded parrots taking flight at the waterhole up near Arnhem Land at one of our sites, Ngalurrtju. Beautiful birds. Little mannequins there, two little grass finches. So having done that science to work out what species are there, what the threats are, the next phase is to work out what we can do to address each of those threats. It's pretty simple, really. It's fire, ferals, and weeds. So if we can improve fire patterns, fire regimes to a point that we think they're ecologically healthy, if we can reduce the impact of feral animals, which is easy for some and more difficult for others, and if we can get on top of the weeds, that's pretty much it. It's a fairly simple recipe, but you've got to have people on the ground to do that work. So we've got a dedicated team, mostly based in the field. At least 70% of our staff are out based at these sanctuaries working every day. That's quite different to other charities because mostly it's the reverse of that. But we really strongly direct our resources into the field. So fire management, I'll just dwell a little bit on that because it's one of the most important tools that we have for managing landscapes in Australia. I guess when we talk about Australian ecosystems, the word wilderness doesn't really apply because there have been people in these landscapes for well over 60,000 years. So if we're trying to protect landscapes, removing people and removing that management doesn't work. We actually need people on the ground. We need people lighting fires at the right time of year. And that, sounds a little bit counterintuitive down south where fire is often a threat or presented as disaster. But up north, fire is part of life. It happens every year. So in the Kimberley, where we've got an especially big network of sanctuaries and partnership sites, we've developed a system of prescribed burning to improve fire patterns. I'll just talk through it a little bit. So basically, every year there's a big wet season up north. Across the savannah, there's a big flush of growth. And all of that grass dries, cures, and becomes fuel. So as the dry season progresses, it dries out. anything will start a fire. It can be lightning, it can be the spark of a match or a campfire that gets out of control. But fire happens at that time of year. If there hasn't been any prescribed burning done, you get big hot fires that sweep through the landscape. And I'll show you what one of those looks like. So that removes not just that grass kind of ground layer, but it kills the canopy trees as well, and completely simplifies the structure of that system. By contrast, and I'll just go back, so these are the sorts of fires that we intentionally put into the landscape using helicopters, often because it's a very big area to manage. So on the map behind here, this is one of our sanctuaries, Charnley River in the Kimberley, and the red lines are where the helicopter is flying out from the base. Sorry, the orange lines are that. The red lines are where it's dropping these incendiaries, starting fires throughout the landscape in that sort of networked pattern. So this is something that we've developed over the last 15 years, and we're now implementing it across this massive area, more than 7 million hectares. So rather than the big, hot, destructive wildfires, we now have a pattern of fires that look more like this. So they're lower intensity. There's kind of three things. They're less intense, they happen less frequently. So you have big patches that haven't burned for maybe 5 or 6 or 10 years, instead of burning every second year. And they're more patchy. So patchiness is something we can actually measure in terms of the size and how they're distributed through the landscape. And those three things are really important for wildlife. So if you look at a species like the Guldian finch, one of our most exquisite bird species, they rely on grass seed, and at different times of year, they feed on different species of grass. When it comes to the wet season, there's just a few species of spinifex that produce seed at that time. So they'll move around the landscape to get to those good patches of food. So they're quite nomadic within the region. The problem is, if spinifex is burnt too regularly, if it's less than 2 years old, it doesn't produce seed. So what we're doing is trying to stretch that frequency out. So instead of burning every 2 years, there are patches of mature spinifex producing seed at the right time of year for these birds. And the result has been a recovery in this population in Kimberley across a really large area. But they're now, you can see them quite easily. They've been removed from the threatened species list, largely due to this kind of fine merging. So it's a great success story. So I said fire, ferals, and weeds are the main things. Feral animals, so the large things like buffalo, cattle, where they're feral in some places, horses, donkeys. We've got camels in Australia as well. They're relatively straightforward in that you can build a stock fence, you can muster them out if it's accessible, or do an aerial cull if it's a really remote area. We know that the impact of these animals is concentrated around wetlands and watercourses. And in Northern Australia, we've now created the 3 largest de-stocked or large feral herbivore-free spaces. So that's in the Kimberley, up in the Gulf at Ngalurrtju, and then, Pungalina, and then the Arnhem Land in the Gulf. So that's another thing, sort of a big lever we can pull to improve how those ecosystems function. And now to the more difficult feral animals to control. I'm sure you're all very aware that feral cats pose a massive threat to Australia's wildlife. We would argue they're the single greatest threat of all of these things I mentioned, but they do interact as well. So we know that if you've got really bad fire patterns, big hot fires, cats take advantage of that. They'll actually travel to the edge of the fire scars and hunt where there's no shelter left for native animals. So we can have some impact by improving fire patterns and leaving more ground cover, more shelter for the native animals. But there's only so much you can do with cats. At this point, it's impossible to remove cats from a very large scale in a permanent way. You can do trapping, you can do shooting, baiting, but it's very hard to have any significant effect on their density. So cats, we know they're killing, the slide is cut off there, but it's 460 odd native mammals per year, 400 million birds per year, 460 million reptiles per year. Colossal numbers. And for birds, that represents about 3 or 4% of the entire bird population in Australia being gobbled up by cats every year. It's a big drain on those wild populations. Another part of the work that AWC does, which you may have heard of, is we've created a network of completely feral predator-free fenced areas. We call them safe havens. And this image is from Mallee Cliffs in southwest New South Wales, where we work in partnership with national parks. So we've now created 8 of these sites on the mainland. Construction begins this week on the 9th one, up in Ngalurrtju near Townsville, and that's for the northern bettong that I showed you before. We've also got Foray Island, which is a little island in Shark Bay, where we don't need a fence because there's a big moat of sharks and to eat any feral. So there's no fence there, but it is feral free. So across that network of safe havens, removing the threat of feral predators means we've got space to actually restore some of those mammals that are missing. So I mentioned, the increasing number of threatened species. For a lot of those, for 34 mammal species, they've completely gone extinct and they're not coming back. But for lots of them, they've declined, but there are still populations either on offshore islands or in the southwest. And that means we've got a chance at repopulating them back into the landscape. So this is that network of safe havens that I mentioned. Another one on Kangaroo Island, which was a response to the bushfires down there. We were able to get in within 6 weeks and build a safe haven to protect a species there, the Kangaroo Island dunnock. I'll come to the reintroductions in a minute, but quite often we talk about the Bilbies and Wombats and bettongs that we can reintroduce. So they're species sort of coming back to the landscape after an absence of a few decades. But for species that have survived in low densities, there are also really clear benefits to excluding cats and foxes. So the next 2 slides are from Mallee Cliffs, that same site in the southwest of New South Wales. And it's probably hard to read the labels here, but these are different species of birds which spend some time on the ground foraging to different extents. So the one on the left there is a quail thrush, chestnut quail thrush, another lovely bird. And the bar for that one is here. So the green columns are the number of sites where we've recorded them inside that cat-free fenced area. The yellow bar, not existent there, is the number of sites where we record them outside the fenced area. So, and they're matched sites, so there's the same number of survey sites inside and outside. So it's massive recovery of ground foraging birds in the absence of cats and foxes. It's not really surprising, but it's really reassuring to know that low densities of those ground birds will bounce back and you get back to the abundance of what they might have been like. Similar story for the southern scrub robin, which is the next set of columns along. And then a very dramatic difference for something like the mallee fowl, this fantastic big mound builder, cousin of our frost turkey. And so this, instead of showing sort of different species, it's showing over time what has happened to the number of active mound nests. And the green bars, again, are inside that fenced feral predator-free area. So throughout the drought, so this goes from about 2011 to 2021, so a 10-year period, you can see the drought really knocked them around. In 2018, that's when we completed eradication of cats from the fenced area, and a massive recovery, partly driven by good conditions, but also by the absence of predators, means that there's lots more nesting activity now without foxes, interrupting or goats even stepping on the mounds and mucking up their breeding. So there's lots of benefits for extant species, but for things like the bilbies or the brush-tailed bettongs, these safe havens mean the difference between survival and extinction. So I'm very lucky. I'm just back from Newhaven Wildlife Sanctuary in Central Australia. I was there a couple of weeks ago, and there last year we introduced woylies, brush-tailed bettongs, which have only survived in the wild in the southwest. So we've now got this population slowly growing at Newhaven. And then just 2 weeks ago, bilbies released back at Newhaven, an area where they've been missing for decades. There are now 4 species that we've restored there, so the marla and the red-tailed pascagale are the others. And I was hoping this video would work, but I don't think it's going to. This was the local school. So Ngalurrtju School came along to that release as well, which is a really special moment. There are about 40 kids of different ages. The Walpri culture is very much intact, and they have the local name for building is Ninu, N-I-N-U, Ninu, so a lovely name. Christine, who's the woman on the left there, is on the AWC team. She works as a ranger at Newhaven, and she was instrumental in removing cats from that safe haven. So it took us about 12 months, and her mother, who's, you know, in her 70s, were out there almost every day tracking cats using traditional methods. So, you know, following their tracks through the sand to remove these cats. So, you know, we couldn't have delivered this project without working with that walk-through community and with these rangers. So then, you know, I mentioned that science runs through everything that we do. So we monitor how these populations respond. This is the woylie, that same little betong that was in the previous slide, at another site in Western Australia, so Mount Gibson Wildlife Sanctuary. And, you know, essentially from a founding population of 50 or so, every couple of years we'll supplement that, but you can see the natural recovery, the natural growth in that population, up to, we think, almost the carrying capacity of that site. So up to, you know, it might go as high as 1,500 in a really good year. That's pretty significant for a species that was down to maybe 10,000, 9,000 animals. So at least a 15 or 20% increase over time. Working good. This was to illustrate the growth of the area over which AWC has an influence. So it started off in Western Australia by a guy called Martin Copley. He was an Englishman but fell in love with Australian wildlife. And from that single property, basically his hobby project, he gradually got some friends together, started fundraising, got Tim Flannery, got some other scientists involved to advise, and built up a board of business people and scientists. Now, you know, as I mentioned, we're working across 13 million hectares, which is about twice the size of Tasmania. So it's really grown over 30 years since AWC was founded in the southwest. The model has stayed largely the same, but partnerships have become an increasingly important part of what we do. So the Kimberley is a great example where you can see the different sorts of partnerships that we have got in place. So Mornington Wildlife Sanctuary is at the southern part of this map in the middle. That's on Gibbert Road, where I was based for 3 or 4 years, and on the Fitzroy River. So we started out working there in about 2004. We've had scientists there on the ground ever since, you know, working there permanently. That extended into a relationship with the Aboriginal community at Tableland, which is now a long-standing and successful partnership. We purchased a couple of adjoining blocks, Marion Downs and Charnley, so these are all past releases. And then the blue one in the west here, Yankee Sound training area. I should use the laser on it. That's actually a defence property. So it was purchased in the 70s. It's in some of the most important conservation landscapes that Australia has. So that really rugged Kimberley, you know, landscape that I showed you at the beginning. And we approached Defence and said, you know, you're sitting on this really important property. Do you realise what biodiversity is there? And they're like, oh, not really. We said, well, we'd like to come work there. How about we contract us to manage it? So they actually pay us to deliver conservation services on their land, which we think is a great result. Through that partnership, we got to know the Dambimangari Aboriginal Corporation. That's the purple outline, part of that map to the north. That's the beautiful coastal landscape that includes the horizontal falls, a lot of those amazing river mouths and intricate islands, hundreds of islands. And we've built a really successful model, working with the Dambimangari people, re-establishing or, you know, reinvigorating their ranger groups to help us with fire management, with science. We've actually just recruited a couple of physicians who are co-badged AWC and Dambimangari, working with our science team. We hope to, you know, train people into managerial positions, into senior ecologist positions as well. So that's a great relationship. And from there, another really great partnership with Willigan Aboriginal Corporation, which, you know, the land is actually much of the centre of Kimberley. We're working with them across 5 blocks of that land. So all of these different sorts of partnerships with government, with Indigenous groups, with pastoralists, and then just off the map here is Bullo River Station. That's a slightly different one where it's a commercial cattle station that has invited us to do conservation management on a big chunk of the property. So partnerships mean we can work over a much bigger area, we can deliver conservation outcomes, and, you know, in many cases we're empowering and engaging with communities as well. Now, I'm going to share with you a couple of the newer projects that you might not have heard about, because these are ones that we've just in the last month or so. So about 6 weeks ago, I've been lucky actually. I've been out to the territory a few times recently. I was out at Ngalurrtju, or Mount Wedge, Central Wedge. If you've been to Central Australia and driven through the West McDonnell Ranges, that spectacular landscape to the west of Alice Springs, this is a kind of offshoot of that to the north. So it's Mount Wedge is a cattle station. Title was handed over to a land trust, Ngalurrtju Aboriginal Land Trust, a few years ago. And they sort of had a few options. They thought, we could actually just lease it back to a cattle farmer and farm cattle across the landscape. But they knew that Newhaven Wildlife Sanctuary, one of AWC's projects, was next door. They'd seen what we've done there, looking after the country really well, getting the fire management running again, working closely with the community. And they actually approached us instead. And we've agreed to sublease Ngalurrtju to manage it alongside Newhaven, essentially doubling that area from sort of 260,000 to over 600,000 hectares. And again, initiate a new ranger group and working with the Central Land Council with existing ranger groups to do fire management, do the science that's needed on that property as well. So it's a very special part of the world. It will be a truly collaborative model, working hand in hand. So we won't be doing anything without the traditional owners or Indigenous ranger groups at Ngalurrtju, and that's just getting underway as we speak. This is the map. So if you've been to Newhaven, that's the western side here. You literally drive through Ngalurrtju to get there. So Mount Wedge itself, over 1,000 metres, it's one of the highest peaks in Central Australia. And this will be a really important landscape for things like the central rock rat, which is the mammal most likely to go extinct in Australia. We think there are still some left in the West McDonnell Ranges, and we'll be able to reintroduce them into the ranges at Newhaven and Ngalurrtju. It's just amazing country out there, really, really special. There's the central rock rat. It's a hard job when you're trying to fundraise for a rat. But, one of the local names for this species is Antina, might be a bit more catchy. And then beautiful princess parrots. So, South Australia is very special inland bird species out there as well. So that's a very exciting project. We can't wait to sort of get out there, do the initial surveys, and get stuck in with improving fire, getting rid of camels, all of that great work. That video didn't work. Anyway, it's a northern hairy-nosed wombat. You might know the northern hairy-nosed wombat. It's very rare. There's only about 315 individuals. So that's really dire straits for species. It's sort of heading down the drain at that point. It's been looked after for a long time at Epping Forest National Park by Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service. And over the last decade, they've established a second population at Richard Underwood Nature Refuge near St George in southern Queensland. So there's about 15 there, 300 at the original site. The point of this is that AWC has become a go-to organisation. So, we've now got the Queensland government calling us up and saying, we've got this threatened mammal, can you help us look after it? So they've agreed that we'll take on management of the second population, that southern one at the nature refuge, and then advise and help them to establish a third and even fourth population of this species. So, again, it's pretty clear what it needs. You need exclusion of predators, you need habitat, and then you need them to breed. So it's a fairly simple formula, but we're the experts in that now, to the point that government is asking us for advice. We're pretty proud to be in that position. The second new partnership that I'd like to talk to you about is a different one again. So based on the sort of trailblazing work that we've done at Buller River Station, where they're selling cattle commercially, but that's all happening on a small section of the property, about 15% of the total area. We've now entered into this amazing partnership with one of Australia's oldest and biggest cattle companies, North Australia Pastoral Company, NAPCO, and they manage a huge area. It's about 3.5 million hectares again. So that's through Channel Country, up into the Barkly Tableland, landscapes where we don't have existing projects, but we know there are populations of threatened species. So they, again, came to us and invited us to help them measure what biodiversity was there and then try and improve biodiversity across that whole network of properties. So yeah, lovely Channel Country, home to some of Queensland's last wild Bilby populations. And it's incredible because they're living on this moonscape, like gibbon plains with cattle walking around and this thriving population of Bilbies with not a skerrick of vegetation. Really weird. So one of the things we need to understand, how has that happened? You know, is it maybe too harsh for cats even? That's one option. But trying to understand, you know, I think there's been a lot of change over the last few months with different industries, different landholders realizing we all have a responsibility to look after biodiversity, no matter what the tenure of the land is. So, you know, whether it is a cattle farmer or whether it's a national park, you know, you need to be keeping track of how those species are going, and you've got a responsibility to look after it. So we're very excited to have this opportunity, partly, you know, to look after some of these landscapes, but I think more importantly to show that pastoralism and conservation don't have to be mutually exclusive. You can have good benefits, good outcomes for threatened species, for conservation, and still make money, you know, still have pastoral productivity. So I'll just bring up the map again and show you those map co-properties. So all of these ones through here, covering a really big area through Western Queensland. And so things like the Plains Wanderer, you know, have their strongholds up in Channel Country. That's one I've never seen actually, so I'd like to get up there and go out spotlighting at night for those. And really, that's it. So yeah, I hope you've been able to see that, you know, we've got a very effective model for conservation. We're quite disciplined in that, you know, we don't do advocacy or campaigning. We're really interested in on-ground management. There's a place for other charities, other organisations to do that lobbying work. We think the biggest difference we can make is getting scientists out on the ground, getting land managers on the ground, and dealing with those threats with fire, feral animals, and weeds, restoring populations of threatened species, and measuring what we do with science. That's AWC's model. I hope you found it a compelling model. I've brought a whole lot of magazines and brochures. There's even some calendars there. You can get half a year's worth out of them. So please help yourself to any of those. I'd love to take some questions after this as well. And just finally, it's almost the end of the financial year. We're a charity. And so we've actually got an exciting matching program at the moment where donations greater than $500 will be matched. So it's a time where you can double your impact. Last thing is that if you're not already signed up to get our updates, you can go to australianwildlife.org and click on subscribe, or just, you know, put your email in at the bottom. There's a space where you can do that. I can even do it for you this evening if you'd like to get more information. But we put out great news stories about conservation. It's a really hopeful, optimistic organisation, and there's a lot more exciting stories to share. So thank you.
Okay, questions? Anyone in the audience? Dave, could you come up the front, please? Dave, could you come up the front? We need to try and get the question out to Zoom. If it doesn't work, we'll try and repeat the question.
Could you enlighten us, please, about the progress being made with the bridle nail-tailed wallaby? Because I know that your organisation has been doing some work on them.
Yep. Yeah, great question. So actually on one of the magazines at the back, there's a bridle nail-tailed wallaby on the cover, so there's an update in there about that species. This is a species, I don't think I've got a photo of it here. Is anyone familiar with it? So it was thought to be extinct from, I think, like the 60s, or, you know, maybe it was thought to be extinct for 60 years up until the 70s. And at that time, there was a fencing contractor working in Queensland, town near Dingo, on a station near the town of Dingo, and going to the Dunny, and he picked up a Woman's Day magazine, and there was this feature on threatened species of Australia, or extinct species of Australia, and it had this bridle nail-tailed wallaby, you know, last seen 60 years ago, definitely extinct, none left. And he said, hang on a second, I've seen those wallabies hopping around where he's been working on the station. So he contacted, I think it was CSIRO or National Parks in Queensland. They did some surveys and confirmed there were some of these wallabies left. They're beautiful animals. They're small. They're fully grown, only that tall, with a really lovely sort of mark. A bridled male tail refers to the pattern sort of across their flank. And yeah, this population was around sort of Taunton Peak National Park. AWC inherited a reintroduced population when we bought Scotia. So Scotia's in Western New South Wales. John Walmsley, who ran that previously, had a population there. So we inherited some of those animals. We've supplemented them with more animals from Queensland over the years. And in the last 5 years, we've established our fenced areas in Pilliga. So that's one of the partnerships with New South Wales National Parks, and also at Mallee Cliffs in the southwest. So we've now got 2 additional populations, as well as the one at Scotia of that species. That's one that was hit pretty hard during the drought. So in Western New South Wales, up until, when was it, 2020, like I guess early 2020 when it started raining, their population dipped quite severely. So work is now looking at that population across those 3 sites. We're part of the recovery team for that species, so working with other agencies to make sure that each population is viable and that if needs be, we can actually move animals between different sites. So, I talked about the translocations that we do. There's actually increasingly this approach that you don't just look after a population, but you think about how all those, the genetics between different populations have different value, how you might get the best, healthiest population by supplementing those in different ways. So they're going well. We've got three populations of that species, whereas 5 years ago we had 1.
I think so, to increase obviously drought period. That's a bit early to say, but has it been slight increase?
Yes, I haven't got the numbers, but as with a lot of Australian mammals and especially macropods, it rains and they breed. So that's quite rapid response. It'll take time for numbers to build up, but yeah, it's looking hopeful.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Joe. Other questions? Marie?
Zooming it, all right?
We hope so. There's nothing out on the chat line yet.
Okay. You showed the iconic policies.
Yeah.
And I have a friend, he's a scientist, not an ecologist, a scientist. He takes it in years, they've got the DNA. When they want to, they can breed up for farming. To me, that's a bit of a energy argument with ecology. What do you say to that?
I love that question. So if the Zoomers didn't hear that, the question was about the Tasmanian tiger thylacine and the question of, I guess it's called de-extinction. So something that is extinct, but if we've got enough genetic material, we might be able to resurrect something like that species or that exact species, and whether that's worthwhile ecologically. I'm torn between the science fiction impulse to yeah, cool, let's bring back the thylacine. But then, just thinking about the way we spend money in conservation, which is limited, we can't do everything. It's going to cost tens of millions of dollars to do that. Then the question is, what are the ethics of releasing this predator back into an ecosystem where it's been absent for 60 years? Could we spend that money on better managing those landscapes as they are? I think probably there are better uses for it. I think it's good to be open-minded with conservation. So I wouldn't say never do that. I think we should invest more in science and do more of that experimental stuff. But I don't think it's a problem that will solve the big ecological. Sorry, it's not a solution to solve that biggest ecological problem.
Because he was putting that up as a model for the species that become extinct. Really, it's not a big problem.
Yeah.
If women want to, we can get them back.
Yeah, I disagree with that. I mean, it's so much better to stop before you get to 0. Like, with the wombats, we're down to 315. I think they need a bit of help before, if we can get the graph going in the right direction, then maybe start thinking about, other species. But there's a whole lot that's threatened and not yet extinct. It's easier to conserve those than it is to try and resurrect them into, ecosystems that have changed. So look after what we've got would be my take.
Okay. One other thing, this is for the open flora and fauna people, as much as it's yourself.
That would be interesting.
A friend of mine was in Oakland Park on Sunday getting tornadoes. Kookaburras were all lined up. They did the dive bomb and took the tornado out of the, it was a man's hand. And I worry because then people will say, oh, we're going to get rid of the kookaburras, they're big thieves, they're going to attack us.
Yeah.
I have been there. We had a picnic. I had a barbecue chicken. And this kookaburra came down, took the chicken and took off. So I had kids crying, people would cricket back, trying to, not come out. It worries me that, this creates this kind of hysteria.
Yeah.
You probably have a good take on that. I hope so.
Any more? No.
It's not so much a question as a statement. All the wildlife groups have a different stick. They do something differently. And the ones at the moment I'm supporting are Bush Heritage BDO. Are you and Bush Heritage in a bit the same line? Although you look pretty much wide Australian and probably a heavier scientific base, both of which sort of appeal to me. I'd like to know how and the fact that I can't say I've heard of the Australian Wildlife Conservancy before. And I've been down there
Yeah.
and my degrees in geology.
Yeah. Well, that's a challenge. So thank you. One of the problems we face is that, we do invest most of our money into the field. So we don't spend a lot on marketing or advertising. I think that's something that appeals to people that want to donate money because, we're not putting up big billboards or paying for any advertising at all. So we do rely on word of mouth on groups like this. That if you know people who are able to support it, or able to support themselves, we really value that. So yeah, thank you for that offer. I think your question about how different conservation groups operate in different ways. Like I said at the start, I think there is space for campaigning organisations. EDO does fantastic work with developments and trying to protect areas threatened by particular projects. The thing that I think distinguishes AWC is how proactive we are. So we'll have staff based in the field. That's a really big difference. So almost all of our sites have permanent staff on the ground, and that's very different to any of those other organisations. Bush Heritage is closest in model to us, but like you said, the investment in science for us is a really strong part of how we think conservation needs to work. And then, there's a few different sort of projects. So we engage a lot more in those big feral predator-free fenced areas. So, 9 of those sites across the country. There's no other organisation doing work like that at that scale. So, I think it's good that there's lots of conservation organisations doing lots of good work. But yeah, I feel most excited by this stuff, obviously. Yeah.
Okay, this one coming in from chat lines from Andrew. Do you have overpopulation issues with herbivores? Do you also add native predation like quolls and dingoes?
Great question. So, we're establishing these big areas, getting rid of cats and foxes, and then reintroducing woylies and marlers and betons, bandicoots. So you might think, populations do grow and eventually you might get issues with overpopulation. That hasn't been a problem yet. Although I guess, when conditions are really good at Scotia, they do graze the undergrowth heavily. At the moment, we don't think those safe havens are large enough to introduce, dingoes, for example. So with their pack structure and their social sort of system, 10,000 hectares isn't enough, to support a population of dingoes, even at our largest sites. For quolls, we're really interested in getting quolls into some of these sites. So in the next, probably the next 2 weeks, we're doing a translocation of quolls into Mount Gibson Wildlife Sanctuary. That'll be interesting because it's not just inside the fence, but outside the fence, where we're doing intensive feral predator control. So I talked a lot about those fenced areas, getting populations up and secure in there. We're also looking beyond the fence at, how can we actually get bilbies to survive in the presence of maybe some cats, but if we do enough control, can we actually suppress those predators to the point where some of the species might be able to establish viable populations outside of fences. We need both. We need that sort of two-pronged approach. But in the short term, we think fences are pretty good. So yeah, overpopulation hasn't been a major issue yet. There are still native predators like goannas, birds of prey, owls. They're all still in there. They've always been there. So that keeps some level of check on the population. At one of the sites, so Yucumurra in South Australia, they've noticed a lot more Murray-Darling carpet pythons moving into the area, living really well on bilbies and oilies, which, is how it should be. There's meant to be pythons out there eating lots of these native mammals. It's probably one of the things that's declined that people haven't recognised, that, pythons which eat small mammals, they're probably in much lower numbers than they would have been originally. So yeah, fascinating questions about how these ecosystems readjust and re-establish as we put these small mammals back into them.
The last one, it's a bit repetitive, but from Andrew again. Do you work collaboratively with other conservation organisations that also operate sanctuaries, e.g. with heritage? So, in terms of lessons learned or successful techniques.
Yes.
So does that add another?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, it does. So yes, there's two ways that we can work with other non-government organisations and research organisations doing work like us. And like I said before, we think it's good that there's a diversity of groups trying to deliver this work in slightly different ways. So learning lessons from each other is largely through science. So we publish all of the work that we do. Eventually our 10 or 15 years of monitoring data is analysed and published to help other managers, in similar landscapes. So we've got, well over, I think it's like 140 scientific publications. We've got a page on our website where you can see all of those if you're interested. Things like the purple crowned fairy wren that I had a photo of, that project has been running for 15 years. So we know every single bird, which nest it was born in, what the big predation threats are and how that's changed through time. They've generated dozens of papers from that single project. So through publishing scientific results, yes, we share knowledge in that way. Through being members of recovery teams, so anything like the Bilby or the Wombat has what's called a recovery team with government representatives, conservation group representatives, working together to work out a strategy to manage each of those species. So I guess that's sort of the scientific collaboration. The other way is through forums like there's this relatively new forum, the Australian Land Conservation Alliance. Bush Heritage is a member, AWC is a member, and it's basically focused on conservation on private land. So outside of the national parks and states, what can we do to further the interests of all of us working to do conservation on private land? So ALCA is becoming more and more active. It is doing some of the lobbying work on behalf of organisations like us, and our chief executive Tim Allard has served as a director on that board. So we're very closely involved in all of those groups. We all know each other. A lot of interns go from one organisation and end up working with the other. So it's a fairly tight-knit community of hands-on conservationists that want to get their hands dirty.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll leave it there. Very quick, Adrian. Very quick.
Very quick. Joey, Adrian. I have a question related to, we heard from Professor Kingsford last year about the amazing digging abilities of bilbies, and therefore a positive impact on the vegetation in the Northwest Wildlife Sanctuary up in the northwest of New South Wales. Have you got any positive stories about what's happening with vegetation in some of those sanctuaries? Thank you.
Yes. And look, it's interesting to look at the sort of ripple effects of introducing these animals like bilbies and bettons. He might have used the term ecosystem engineers. So they're species that have a sort of outsized impact on the landscape. Bilbies are a great example where we know that their burrows become really good for the local germination, sort of microclimates, I guess. More water infiltration, more leaf litter is gathered. So yes, we've done studies at Scotia showing germination rates improve. Yeah, I don't know the specific species that have changed over time, but yeah, they definitely change that whole dynamic of how the soil operates over time. So yeah, it'll be interesting, especially at Newhaven in the desert, where we've just put those diggers back in a month ago, to see what happens out there.
That's great. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
Good talk. I'd like to ask Jeff Ennis on Ops behalf to give you a vote of thanks.
Well, thanks, Joe. This is a fabulous talk. You see the passion and enthusiasm that they brought to the group here, and your ideals for OPC are very much aligned with us ideas in terms of nature conservation. It's also interesting to see that it's more than just trying to save charismatic species. We're looking to save all sorts of hundreds of species that are out there up against the brink of survival. And it also extends not only through the fauna, but also the field as well, and the landscapes in general. So on behalf of Rock, thank you very much for a fabulous talk, and we've no doubt had a dream job. I think a lot of enthusiasm and encouragement. And keep up with it.
Thank you. I feel very lucky, and so grateful for the opportunity to come and share this work with all of you, and the enthusiasm is matched in this room, I think. So thank you all for coming along tonight on this cold night. And yeah, please do take the magazines and read more about AWC. Sign up for more. Thank you.
Into our general business, you can see the sort of
Lots of
things we do. So while we're packing up, we better you want to take the a couple of items of general business earlier on. Just following on from the exhibition, Liz briefly mentioned it, that it's Ops' turn to do the calendar for 2023, and so we're piggybacking on the exhibition, where we encouraged a lot of photographs to be handed in, and so we had more than we used in the exhibition.